All right, next we're going to have a panel led by Daniel Weingarten on our Ascend team. Daniel is a PhD and a senior energy analyst at Ascend. He brings 10 years of scientific research experience to his planning and analysis work with our team, and he completed his physics PhD researching next-generation photovoltaic technologies at NREL here in Boulder, culminating in a patent for his original work. Daniel holds a physics PhD from CU Boulder and a BA in physics from UC Berkeley. Please welcome Daniel.
Hello again. I'm getting extra mics here. So coming up here in a different capacity from yesterday, now I get to wrangle 5 people on stage rather than the whole audience of folks. And for the panel today, I would say love-hate is perhaps an overly strong term, but love-frustration might be a bit of an explanation for the dynamic between vendors and off-takers in a lot of RFPs. There's the bread and butter of utilities, off-takers, CCAs is getting these resources submitted, but the process of going through them can be so arduous. And similarly for vendors, they need to get the things sold, but it can be frustrating sometimes. RFP writers are generally known to study carefully the writing habits of high school freshmen to get the similar levels of vague and indistinct RFPs, so no one really knows what they're going for. And meanwhile, vendors seem to take all the time and effort to go through the office and dump every available drawer into a nice, succinct 714 distinct proposals that they'll just throw out. This is obviously an oversimplification here, but I think is getting at kind of the center of what we're going to be coming at in this clean energy RFP panel of kind of a lot of the contrasts that are shown between what vendors are proposing and what off-takers are looking for in their RFP process. So we'll do things slightly differently from a lot of the panels we've had so far. Instead of doing kind of presentations, mini speeches from each presenter, and then followed by questions, I want to turn this into a conversation. So we're really trying to keep some short intros from each of the panelists, and then just spark a conversation among them. I'll throw in some questions to keep things interesting, and then keep some space at the end for you guys to have questions. But we're looking for some friendly bombs to be lobbed back and forth, and hopefully come to a better understanding of how RFP processes can maybe run a little more smoothly. So I'd like to welcome my whole panel up here. Just come on up and grab a seat. I'll introduce you guys before you each give your talk. So please welcome our RFP panelists. I'll scoot you down one. Yeah, thank you. Sit on there. Cool. So we'll start things off with Monica Padilla. Monica is the Director of Power Resources at Silicon Valley Clean Energy, where she leads the team responsible for planning and carrying out the various energy and capacity procurement activities consistent with SVCE's policies. She also covers the financial and risk management objectives and holds a BS in business from Cal State University, East Bay. I've also had the pleasure of working with Monica, and she is on top of nearly everything, so pay careful attention to her wisdom.
So I'm not doing my slides?
You are.
Oh, okay.
That green button's advances.
Okay. So,
Just keep your chair. I'm not sure. Oh, slide guide.
I didn't do it. I just pushed the button. Should I do it again? Okay, well, apparently I can't follow instructions because I actually prepared a few slides for this one. I don't know what I did. There, okay.
Green button at the top.
All right, so yesterday, if you were here, I talked a little bit about who we are and what a community choice aggregator is in California. If you missed that, you missed the fact that I publicly said that I had a fake load. But I should remind everybody that we have an actual load that we have to meet. And part of that load comes with a whole lot of obligations, including having to meet our renewable portfolio standard for the state of California. And so today's focus, or my talk today, is just mainly about the process that we went through in the second round of RFOs that we did to try to lock in some long-term renewable resources. But just a little bit of background information. So SVCE is a community choice aggregator in the state of California. And there are many aggregators now. I think, I don't even know the number, but it's something between 19 and 25. And all of those CCAs have a long-term obligation, just like the IOUs do in California, that they have to meet at least 65% of their renewable portfolio standard for compliance period number 4, which is 2021 through 2024, with long-term resources, that is contracts for 10 years or more. So because of that, many of the CCAs have been very active in signing PPAs for the last few years. And I think this might be out of date right now, but these are just some of the projects that have been contracted for on the various PPAs throughout the state. For Silicon Valley Clean Energy, we issued our first RFP back in 2017, along with the Monterey Bay Community Power. And through that process, we negotiated 3 PPAs. 2 of them are for solar plus storage. One is the EDF's project Big Bow, and the other is Recurrence RE Slate project, both located in the Central Valley. One's in Kings County and the other is in Kern. Don't ask me which is which. And then another one is for a fairly large share of the Duran Mesa project from Pattern in New Mexico. And that one is scheduled to come online sometime in 2021, 2022. So all of these are in our IRP now, and they're all part of our portfolio on a going forward basis. They'll represent about 20% of our needs on an annual basis once they come online, and about 20% of our long-term obligation. And so our overall long-term obligation during that 4th compliance period that I talked about, 2021 through 2024, is about 26%. So we're close to getting to the long-term need. So again, California has some pretty aggressive renewable portfolio standards, and these are driven mostly by a need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I believe that they're trying to get to 30,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions associated with the electricity sector by 2030, and a reduction of emissions of 40% of 1990 levels by 2030 as well. Through legislation that was passed last year, they increased the RPS yet again. This would be like the 3rd or 4th time. And so the new RPS that we're kind of targeting is a 60% by 2030. And then they also have this really big goal to get to carbon-free by 2045, but they haven't figured out how they're going to get there yet without natural gas, so that's another issue. So for Silicon Valley Clean Energy, we have a 50% RPS and a 50% non-RPS portfolio, which is mainly large hydro coming out of the Northwest. And we also have a directive, or we had a directive, I should say, to avoid geothermal and biofuel resources. So when we procure, these are some of the things that drive our procurement decisions. But in this last RFP that we issued in 2018, our main thing there was to get to our RPS requirements, including this long-term obligation. And I'm not going to go through all these. So when we went through that process, again, our full intent was just to get the volumes needed to meet that requirement and to get them done in the least cost possible. But through that process, we encountered a whole bunch of challenges. And some of those challenges had to do with what we were hearing from the state, from the ISO, and from the CPUC about a potential reliability issue, and that so many of us CCAs, including ourselves, were adding on so many intermittent resources in the future that they were concerned that we're not going to have enough energy or capacity to meet our hourly load. And so they're in the process of perhaps mandating some procurement related to reliability. But basically, it had to change. We had to rethink what it is we're after and what it is our community or our board has directed us to do, and that happened midway through this RFP process. So we issued the RFP. We got 57 projects, 170 different offers. Most of them were solar plus storage. We used Ascend Analytics to help us both administer the RFP and the magnitude of proposals that we got, and evaluate them, and they use their Power Sim and Battery Sim tools in order to help us essentially come up with what was the energy value associated with each of these projects. And so when we were looking at the energy value of the solar plus storage, I think the person who was speaking before talked about, what is the energy value of storage? And we did use their tool to look at both. If we only valued it on a day-ahead basis, what would be the value of storage? Whereas if we dispatched it into the hourly or sub-hourly market, what would be the value? But for us, that was definitely a reason to pick storage if we were able to dispatch it into the sub-hourly market. But our board has taken more of a strategic, long-term view on storage, that if we're going to keep adding a whole lot of solar to the grid, that we have to do our part and add storage to go with it. Whether we can see the value in it today or not is not their focus. They know that it's part of the solution in the future. It's part of the solution in meeting our greenhouse gas reduction goals, trying to get to carbon-free 24/7, and also a financial solution. So that's pretty much the reason we picked it. In addition, it also has some resource adequacy value, although we're not sure what that's going to be because the Cal ISO and the CPUC haven't figured out the rules on how they're going to count RA from these hybrid resources, but we know it's going to have more than zero value. So you can see here, this is a graph that Ascend put together. There's a big distribution of costs associated with the different technologies, with solar and storage not being the lowest, but certainly being the lowest that meets our objectives. So, but because we had these challenges, we decided not to pick just the lowest price projects or the best value projects. We actually shortlisted and are in the process of negotiating 4 solar plus storage contracts and then 2 geothermal contracts. And so remember, our board had directed us not to look at geothermal. They feel that geothermal has emissions associated with it and therefore is not in line with our carbon-free mission. But we explained to them it very much is in line with our carbon-free emissions because it allows us to have a baseload renewable in our portfolio that helps us meet these 24/7 objectives that we want to get to at some point in the future. And so it is a clean source of resource. In fact, the technology that we're contracting with is a binary technology, so it doesn't produce any CO2 emissions. It's a closed-loop system. But even so, even if there are some small anthropogenic emissions associated with it, we figure we could find a way to neutralize those emissions and still be consistent with our objective. That's all I had.
Great.
No.
All right, excellent. So that was excellent intro from the CCA side. Now we'll move on to Glendale Water and Power Municipal Utility, with Mark providing goals or lessons learned from a slightly larger scope RFP. Let me give you the intro here. Apologies. So, Mark Young is the Deputy General Manager at Power Management at Glendale Water and Power. Along with a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Phoenix in Business Management, Mark has over 38 years of experience in power generation, operations, contract implementation, and administration, marketing, and power resource planning. That's a lot of different categories there, but having worked with Mark for an extensive period of time, I can verify that he wears many hats and somehow seems to excel at all of them. So, worth listening to.
Well, thank you. 38 years, it's a long time. I was hoping not to have to sit on a panel like this in my career, but it looks like I'm going to not be able to be successful in that endeavor. So, City of Glendale is a bedroom community in Los Angeles. It's completely surrounded by Los Angeles. It was established in 1906, population of about 203,000. Summer peak of about 350 megawatts. We're considered a metered substation because we're in Los Angeles' balancing authority. And I like to think of us as like a mini-me to LA, because if LA is involved in a project, we want to get involved in the project. Since we have tentacles close to what James indicated yesterday, we just find it very advantageous to hang out with the big boys and get the good projects like Eland. So, what were we trying to do with our RFP? We've been trying to repower a Grayson facility for about 15, 20 years. Our oldest power plant, our oldest steam unit was built in 1941, before World War II, and the newest was 1977. So you can see that they're past their life expectancy. Unfortunately, we're ground zero for Sierra Club, so they're doing everything in their power to prevent us from being able to repower our facility. And as a result, we've asked Ascend Analytics to come and help us with, one, our IRP, and two, with the Clean Energy RFP. So the goals of the Clean Energy RFP were to meet SB 100 goals, and I don't have to explain that since that was just done. And our constraints are that we have reliability issues, we're extremely transmission limited, and we have to have proven technology on all the proposals for the Clean Energy RFP. We can't have proof of concept because we're going to take off actual generation units, and we need to replace them with something that works. So our solution to this problem was that we were going to get a BESS system. We were going to get a 50 megawatt, 200 megawatt hour battery locally inside Grayson. Grayson is our local facility. We were going to be very aggressive with the DER program, where we thought that we would be able to get 10 megawatts-ish of DER. We're looking at something more aggressive like 40 to 50 megawatts of DER. I personally don't know how we're going to do that, but we're going to try. And the rest would be made up with thermal generation, and we're looking at versatile, quick start units that can help us integrate renewables into our portfolio. So the lessons learned that were good. In the RFP, we made it very vague, and we did that on purpose. We wanted to let businesses figure out ways to help solve our problem. And we were very happy. We got 34 vendors responded to our RFP. The RFP was to reduce our greenhouse gases and attempt to increase our renewable portfolio standard in whole or in part. And that was very enlightening that there were so many people that were trying to assist Glendale. Like I said, we got more DER capacity than initially thought. 40 to 50 when our peak is a 350 megawatt system is pretty aggressive, but we think with the companies that proposed those proposals, they're established companies, so we have faith that they can perform what they indicate that they can. Let's see. The battery storage issue. The battery storage issue has been an issue since we're thinking or very concerned about fires and explosions that have happened lately. But we indicate that system battery is able for us to be able to maximize our transmission capacity and allowed us to have some load shift capabilities so we don't have to build to 350 megawatt peak. We can build to something less, since our peak is only for a very short period of time in the summer. The lessons learned that were not so good. The RFP, again, was written very vague, so people that responded did not really get the idea of what we were looking for. So some of them were very off base, and for that we apologized. But we wanted to give them the ability to help us find a solution. The reliability and transmission constraints were simply not addressed, since we know that Southern California Basin is extremely transmission limited. That transmission limitation was not appreciated by some, where there were options where we could buy solar projects in Nevada, and don't worry, we'll get transmission to you after you sign the PPA for 25 years at 200 megawatts. So those type of things weren't going to happen. We had to make sure that the transmission was actually, or the resource was actually given to us at our city border. There was also pilot and proof of concept projects, the perpetual motion machines at $2 billion, but not to worry, since you just start those things and then electricity is free forever. We actually thought about that for about 1 second, but it was actually interesting. Proof of concepts are okay, but in this instance, the RFP was clearly indicated that it had to be a proven concept. And most importantly about the lessons learned was that the proposers some of the proposers tended to enjoy their solution more than explaining to me how that solution was going to solve my problem. And that's a big deal. There were some good solutions, but they weren't going to solve my problem. I thought, molten salt is a great idea, but it was not going to solve my problem. So my suggestion to people that are going to answer the RFP is to know your customer. If you don't understand the customer, if you're not sure what the issues are, please let us know. And we were answering questions left and right to try to get clarity, because the more you understand, the better product I'm going to have when I go ahead and I float $500 million of bond. So those were the lessons learned. And I think with Ascend's help, our solution is going to be very progressive. We could potentially be a model. I think that other municipals in our area are probably not like us, but with Ascend's help, we were able to do what we needed to do, and for that we appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Pass that over to Eric, actually.
Okay.
So that was perspectives from our two off-takers here. And now we'll get a flip side of the coin, where I'm sure there'll be some unique perspectives and perhaps some carefully worded retorts. So to start things off on the vendor side, we've got Eric Stoutenburg. He's the Chief Development Officer at Able Grid and has over 9 years of experience in the renewable energy industry at large. He's currently managing development activities for Able Grid's 7 gigawatt portfolio of utility-scale energy storage projects across the United States. He holds a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Stanford University and a BS in Mechanical Engineering from the United States Military Academy. I know a few people across Ascend have worked closely with him, and I've heard nothing but great things, so looking forward to hear what you have to say, Eric.
All right, yeah, thanks. So 9 years in the industry, I thought I'd give I'd step back and not do like a sales pitch on why batteries are great, which is what we do, but rather just sort of like some candid observations in what's hopefully a safe space of like what's wrong with the RFPs, and sort of like, it's not only my personal experiences, but those of all my colleagues who've worked at other developers, public, private, small. We have somebody on our team who was selling contracts for merchant coal plants when I was 6 years old, so I've also sort of incorporated some of his clever remarks and experiences. So I think this sort of quote describes what it feels like both for utilities and for developers when an RFP comes out. There's a whole bunch of foolishness, to your point. There's, I think, some wisdom out there that sometimes surprises utilities, going looking for one solution and find out there's something clever out there. A lot of hope and despair for developers. And the RFP process is a little bit like Winston Churchill said about democracy. It's like, it's the worst form of procuring anything, except for all the other forms of doing so. So this is what it feels like when you're a developer. We really think that we're putting in a ton of late hours. We've worked for years on projects to present this like wonderful meal for you. And if I'm candid as a developer, what we know we're actually doing is just throwing a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and hoping that it actually sticks, right? Because oftentimes the RFP isn't written in such a way that I know what meal you're looking for. You're looking for capacity, looking for 100 megawatts in 2023, but then you maybe fail to explain like, what is that capacity need? Is that around the clock capacity? Because that sort of limits what solutions you'll provide. Or are you looking for a real peaking capacity solution, and that maybe lends itself maybe more to storage or solar plus storage or other things, or demand response. So I think all developers we were candid know we're doing that, and that's why you get, you ask for one specific thing and we throw kind of the book at you. The other reason we do that is oftentimes these projects are so unique in their characteristics, they won't really fit the round hole that you're trying to solve for. We have a bunch of square pegs. And so we kind of have to throw you, hey, what about a later COD? What about an earlier COD? I would imagine that you guys feel like this when you're the utility. You were looking for one noodle and we kind of gave you everything all over. So I try to attribute most of these errors to sort of, a tale of two businesses, to keep this quote going. On the developer side, in the end, most of us are engaged in what's almost basically real estate development. It's very risked. It's long lead stuff. We're trying to make something out of nothing. And we're trying to do so in understanding the context of your needs, but also, foreshadowing or trying to stay a step ahead of what your needs are. Because we're the ones who see like, hey, solar and plus storage is really cheap, but if we went back to anybody's 2016, 2017 IRP, we would probably not see anybody saying like, we're gonna do a bunch of solar plus storage in the future, because you're not seeing those price things come up very much. The other reason we end up providing what might be considered messy proposals or messy offers is we have much more limited data and information than you guys do as a utility. You don't present everything through the IRP, you don't present everything in the RFP, a lot of the data is confidential or FERC classified. Likewise, my understanding of utilities, having not worked at one, but having colleagues who have, in the end, you're looking for capacity, energy, ancillary services, attributes associated with those, whether that's locational value, or a green attribute, emissions free, et cetera. And then you guys are sort of dealing with a hydra of stakeholders. Internal staff who think they know the solution of something, board members, PUC also think they have a different solution, advocacy groups, et cetera. So you guys have a lot of sausage making to do on your side, and we end up presenting a variety of sausages, not all the ones that you're looking for. So I'd say the main failure modes of the RFP is developers assuming you have a need. We shouldn't do that, but we're going to anyways. And so we'll often write, perpetual motion machine, responses like, you really need this. And you're like, I actually don't need that. And likewise, most RFPs, even well-written ones where they're like all source and I'm only describing these products that I need, they're often assuming a solution. And that either came out of their IRP or assuming that they understand the costs or what developers can offer. So that'd be sort of my main criticism of developers. We're still kind of throwing everything at the fence, and I think that's the appropriate place for private developers to throw you a small, modular reactor at you, as well as just a storage-only solution, as well as, God forbid, a coal plant. But it's also maybe not the best place for utilities to always go out presuming they know what that solution is to their specific capacity, energy, or ancillary service need, because then it prevents developers from coming up with creative solutions and to follow technology as it's going faster and faster. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Eric. Definitely contrasting point of view there that I think will be continued on with these other vendors here, of just the theme of, what is actually needed in this RFP and how many proposals do we get before we'll actually nail it. So next up, to expand on that perspective, we got Joshua Rogol, who serves as the Senior Vice President of Energy Storage at Strata Solar, leading origination and development of standalone and solar plus storage projects across the U.S. He's responsible for contracting over 500 megawatt hours. And Josh holds a BA in International Relations and Economics from Tufts University in magna cum laude as well, and has completed additional studies at La Universidad de Playa Ancha in Valparaíso, Chile. So let's hear from Josh.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Good morning. I think this will dovetail very nicely with the comments you made. The wording that I had for the title of the slide was a little stronger, and my origination team made me pull it back a little bit. But we dislike putting all of these options to the off-taker as much as they dislike reviewing it. And so we walked into an investment committee meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the origination team had 54 configurations of a proposal to an off-taker. And those proposals were based on various solar sizes, various solar plus storage sizes, different CODs, settlement at the bus bar versus the node, looking at different durations of storage for various RA values or shape products. And so it was just overwhelming. And the amount of time that the engineering team put into engineering the configurations, the finance team to running the models, the development team to pulling those together, investment committee team reviewing was just overwhelming, and it totally stinks. The off-takers of these projects don't like doing it either. It's overwhelming for them, and to the analogy about that plate of pasta and throwing it against the wall, it's when we don't understand what the actual need is, this is kind of the approach that we have to take to putting all the stuff to them to sort of run it through and see whatever that black box valuation methodology is that pops out, hopefully with success. So that's sort of the pain that we feel on both sides as we go through this. And so, a recent case study for us of something that we actually did contract is a 400 megawatt hour battery with Southern California Edison. So it's a 100 megawatt resource adequacy asset. This was in the Golitos Moore Park solicitation from earlier this year. It's an asset that will come online at the end of 2020. But even in this process, what we had to put forward based on system size, COD, product, so was it just RA or was it a full toll where Edison would take the capacity, energy, and ancillary benefits? I can't remember what the final number of proposals were, but it was something like 40 options. That takes a tremendous amount of engineering, finance, and teamwork. And for Edison, they're trying to take all the puzzle pieces and put them together in a way that solves their ultimate need. So optionality is helpful, but it's just a tremendous amount of work. So that was challenging, and sort of there's a lot of effort and so of activity that if we understood the need better, we could focus on the specific solution to solve that need. And I think there's ways that we could bring more value in a focused effort to that specific configuration. But some of the things that have been sort of interesting on this project is the evolution in thought on the battery side. I thought might be helpful to talk about today is the technology and attributes of that technology and how it ties to solving that need. So, in terms of a system architecture, a building-based versus a container-based solution, and how during the development process, that architecture drives permitting risk, which drives project risk, which drives cost that gets bottled, and insurance costs, and ultimately the price that we're able to offer the offtake. So we've learned a lot in this project and how that all flows through. Our original thesis was that a building-based solution was definitely going to be the way to go, that there was a lot of cost efficiency for the O&M, and as we went through the process, it became crystal clear that it would put so much uncertainty into the timeline on the permitting side that container-based solutions or cabinet-based solutions is a far superior technology and ultimately led through to a better proposal. In terms of the other issues that have come up, on the off-taker side, just something to think about is even within an off-taker that controls interconnection and has a procurement group that is procuring from the same company, those two sides are not talking to each other. And so lining up and making sure that, the timeline and need is tied out with both sides of that organization while still that same organization can definitely tie into the risk profile of the project and make something either tenable or untenable. A few examples of early projects in the solar and storage space where projects have been contracted, some have started coming online across 3 separate off-takers is APS, NV Energy, and HECO. A few of these projects have been referenced earlier today by other speakers. But the off-takers, I thought, in all 3 cases, did a good job in defining the need, the value of that need, and what they explicitly did not want. And I think as a developer, it enabled the development community then to put together specific projects and configurations of those projects that allowed us all to be reasonably efficient in how we went at it. And so I'd encourage the off-takers that the more definition around communicating what those specific needs is and how you are valuing that solution, it helps us in making sure that our projects and solutions meet that need well. Yeah, that's all I got.
All right. Thanks very much for your comments, Josh. And to bring it on home, we've got Luke Hansen here to speak. He's the Senior Director at 8 Minute Solar Energy and has announced 3 solar plus storage PPAs totaling 435 megawatts and nearly 2 gigawatt hours of energy in solar plus storage systems. Luke holds a bachelor degree in electrical engineering and international affairs from the University of New Hampshire and graduate degrees in sustainable energy engineering from the University of Maryland, College Park. Let's get some final thoughts from the vendor side here.
Okay, thank you.
The top one. Green one.
Okay. Sorry, it's a bit of an eye chart there on the big screen, isn't it? What I want to do is look at, I've been at 8 Minute for about 2.5 years, and where was the state of RFPs 2 years ago versus now? And what are the products, essentially, that we're trying to provide for utilities and for the market from 2 years ago versus now? How has that evolved? And it's really reflects what most of the group here has said. But if you look at 2017, 90% of our RFPs that we responded to were renewable generation, generate as available. We were trying to find the lowest levelized cost of energy for solar. PPA terms, if you go back 2+ years, were traditionally 20 to 30 years, and the merchant curve on the back end was really the bonus part. Some of the differentiators pretty much was cost on the dollar per megawatt hour as generated. Just trying to meet the renewable portfolio standard. When you deliver it, it's not so important. And small differentiators could be congestion, basis to load, but oftentimes that was even less of a factor. Now, in 2 years, it's evolved to essentially a completely different story. Most of the time, the product is renewables for storage, for us, solar plus storage. And it could be many different things that the product that we are proposing. It is not generate as available. Sometimes, if we're lucky, it's generate as available renewable energy, and then a capacity price for storage, and the off-taker, the utility, wants full control of the battery. And there are relatively narrow parameters of what we're trying to do. And if you have a basic understanding of the market, you can optimize your cost of your project, have fundamentals of your solar project are good, and then pick a quality storage product that's bankable and competitive on cost, and you've got something that can be competitive in the market. But most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, it's a whole bunch of different various things that we're proposing and that the off-taker is looking for. It could be a flat dollar per megawatt hour, but unknown definition of storage. Often the RFP will say, we're looking for renewable energy, this many megawatt hours per year, and we would like proposals of renewables plus storage. Please offer us the best value. And we're left with, well, gee, okay, now what? And so that is really, those kinds of questions in RFPs are what led us to Ascend, and what led us eventually to this stage here, is that how to figure out what the utility is looking for when they intentionally write an RFP, which is fairly vague, because they're looking for diversity. But now that puts the burden on us often to start with the fundamentals of trying to understand the utility's business. Try to understand the fundamentals of what do I think is valuable to the utility. A lot of times that's, we can figure out some rough understanding by looking at the market and data points. If it's Glendale, they're not in CAISO, but I don't have access to their prices or load, but I can look at CAISO prices and load and guess that they're similar fundamental costs and load shape, and try to make some rough estimations for what's going to be valuable. But it is definitely, it's a lot of times throwing spaghetti at the wall. There's a lot of guesswork, and it's not just look at the data. Often it's a lot more work than that. And there's a lot of talking to various experts. There's a lot of talking to the utility and so on. The hardest part about that is when you're looking at just trying to translate from a world of lowest dollar per megawatt hour to now you want renewables plus storage at lowest dollar per megawatt hour if it's all in. Well, the lowest solar plus storage cost is no storage. So how do I figure out what's the right thing there? Other complexities, utilities are often now looking for much shorter terms, 15 years, maybe 8 years, and putting the burden of future risk on what will be merchant prices, or will there even be LMP prices, or are we going to be in a post-LMP world? Putting all that risk on the developer and the financiers of the project. That adds another huge complexity of risk. And then the winners are, maybe it's a reasonably well-defined process to get to a winning project, but often, as I said, a much more treacherous journey. Next slide, here we go. So as thinking about this, I've bucketed the kinds of proposals that we see into 3 different kinds. And the one going from left to right, the first is a fully defined RFP process that has time of day weighting. This is definitely, to reflect what Josh said, from our perspective, the best. It helps the developer to the greatest extent. We can say, here's the time of day pricing. I can build a software program to optimize my bid, or work with Ascend, who has tools that they provide to developers like us that can help us iteratively go back and forth with Ascend and help us optimize our bid and say, okay, if energy is worth, in the case of the NV Energy block there in the top left, where we've announced a project, it was worth 6.5x in that evening block in the summer, or 1x in the summer. So if our price was $10 in the base period, then it would be $65 for all energy that was delivered in the blue box. And in those 3 summer months, we'd have full control over the battery, but the rest of the year, the NV Energy would be able to control the battery. And from their perspective, they thought that giving a limited window in the summer where they know they're going to need to serve their large peak load, they're willing to give up some of that control that would help pay for the battery, and then in the rest of the year, they would take the control back and give themselves the flexibility because they didn't know how they were going to use it. So it's a little bit of a balance versus APS, where they're locking in time of day prices in the bottom left, with locked in prices for the entire 15+ year term of the project. Doesn't give APS any flexibility as to how that system is going to get dispatched in the future as their load changes, as their resource mix changes. And so it helps the developers a lot to optimize the solution, and arguably helps the off-taker because they get carefully optimized solutions that get them the best cost if they can define their problem in the long run. But the major downside to the off-taker seems clear, that they lose the flexibility. They can't change the way that they're going to operate the plant 5 or 10 years down the line when their resource mix has dramatically changed. The next grouping there in the middle, I'm a pretty big fan of this one because I think it gives kind of both benefits. At the top middle is SRP. They had an RFP last year where they gave indicative time of day weighting, and they said, we will evaluate the RFPs off of this time of day weighting. So you can have a 1x price similar to those on the left in the light blue, and then I forget exactly, I think it was 2x for the I don't know, ocean blue, and like 4x or something like that in the dark blue. And so what they did is they provided a structure that said, this is how I'm going to evaluate your RFP. Structure your wind plus storage or solar plus storage or any other resources, all source RFP. Structure it such that you're going to maximize the profit, or minimize your 1x dollar per megawatt hour price to us. But at the end of the day, when I contract it, it's going to be a flat dollar per megawatt hour, and I have full flexibility to operate it however I want over the 20-year term. So it helps us optimize the project, give them what they're looking for if they were able to partially define their problem, but then also gives them the flexibility to change how they're going to use it in the future. And I think that's a really great mix. At the bottom center is a similar from XL, also from last year. They only gave, you can't read it at all, but they gave time of day weighted pricing for the summer that helped give the developers a similar estimate or idea of what it is, how they were going to be evaluated, but then they were going to have full control. So those are two nice ways for us to deal with the problem. Unfortunately, that's only 10% of the bids that we put forth. Everything else goes on the right, where it is much more involved, much more guesswork, maybe 40, 50 bids or variants to the bid that we'll put into the RFP. We try to limit that to the extent we can for the sanity of our own team and also for the off-taker evaluating it. But in order to try to limit it, it takes a tremendous amount of effort. So we try to put much more work onto the front end, sometimes still guessing, but hoping that through our analysis we can get to somewhere that is closer to what the off-taker is actually looking for. And so how do we tackle this? Three main points that I've really already considered, discussed here, is we spend time going out and talking to the customer, trying to get that audience in advance of the RFP to try to understand what is important for them for grid reliability. What is their load shape? How do they want their products structured? Are they going to be looking for all-in dollar per megawatt hour on solar plus storage, renewables plus storage? Or are they really just looking for RA and we have to figure out how to go split that product? We have seen products win in the marketplace. SCAPA, for example, signed deals for just renewable energy credits, and the project ended up getting built solar plus storage because that developer was using selling the RA someplace else and using the storage to help manage the basis risk between their project and the node where they are settling with SCAPA. Fascinating evolutions in the procurement space, but much order of magnitude more complex than that 2017 world. Then we spent a lot of time analyzing the ISO, whether that be ERCOT or CAISO, developing for our proposals what we call a value, which is of the project, of the proposal, the benefit of the project over the cost, and then trying to present that to the utility so that we're not just in love with our project location and the basis of it, but we're trying to express what is the benefit to you, the off-taker, and hopefully we're hitting your goals. And then lastly, some things that we hope the off-takers will put more consideration to in the future is what is beyond just the cost, what are the other intangibles of the proposal from the developer, their experience, their controls integration on how is this going to actually work when it gets built, the safety considerations they're putting to the project, those sorts of things.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I guess I'll grab the clicker here. So, I feel like that was a number of good perspectives, and a theme that came up to me over and over from what you all were saying is this kind of tension between, as Mark put it, intentionally vague RFPs saying, hey, you guys are the experts here, show us your creativity in meeting these either narrowly or broadly defined needs, but show us what you got, versus some of the preferences you guys were stating of having a very clear, this is what we need, now we can give you one proposal. And clearly there's benefits to both sides, right? Getting precise, equally weightable proposals, and then you can basically weight them by price, or seeing what you guys got, since you guys are the experts. And I want to kick off a conversation and see if you guys have any responses to that tension between bring an interesting thing to the table versus here's what we need.
Well, I'll start, I guess. First, my goal is to meet load. My goal is to make sure that electricity is supplied to the customer. I concentrate on reliability and making sure that transmission constraints and things like that are abided by. I don't keep my finger on the pulse of emerging markets. I think that would be something that solar developers and battery developers do. So when I look for something, I want to be vague. With our RFP, we didn't normally want to be vague, except that we had a portfolio problem, and it was going to take out our whole local generation facility, and we were looking for options. I would have rather have put out 3 specific RFPs, but when you do that, then you miss things. The problem with 2017 and 2019 is that in 2017, I could buy any renewable project, put it into my portfolio, and use my existing portfolio to vary to accommodate that project. And as the RPS requirements are getting higher and higher, now I have to find things that actually fit into my portfolio, and that becomes very problematic, especially if I don't know what your systems can do. And like I said, I don't keep my finger on the pulse. Through SCAPA, I've seen a lot of RFPs, 20, 30, 40, maybe 100 of them, and the majority of them missed the point. So we're not doing it on purpose. We're doing it because we feel that you guys are the specialists and the professionals in that manner, and you can spur something in me to figure out how your solution can better suit my problem.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say these are mutually exclusive objectives. So if you narrowly define the need, and the need includes a requirement for flexibility beyond, a certain time frame, like beyond 5 years, I'm not sure if the capacity need that I'm currently describing is going to morph or change or a market form. You can put that in the RFP as well. Say, this is a problem I need to solve for, is a market reform's coming up, maybe my load's going to be higher or lower in the future. Help me also solve that narrow flexibility need in your proposal. So I don't think you have to do one or the other.
Perhaps a little more insight into, besides least cost, best fit, what are the attributes and the associated values and how you guys are going to look at it? So we bid a out-of-state resource to a CCA recently, and we found out down the line that there was a strong preference for in-state because that there was labor pushback, and they want to support those objectives. And so it's flexibility, as you said, can be incorporated, but understanding what the criteria are along the way just helps with efficiency of developing projects you're going to like better.
So I don't know where my RFP fell on that spectrum of ill-defined or well-defined. But I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, we tried our best to define exactly what we wanted. And within that definition included a whole lot of flexibility and control on our side. So for us, it was very important that we took control of the battery if the resource came with the battery. And by that, we wanted to be the scheduling coordinator. We wanted to just pay a capacity payment, take advantage of the ITC, obviously. But because we don't know exactly when those valuable hours are going to be for us today. We might know what it's going to be right now, but we don't know what it's going to be when these projects come online, or 10 years from now, or 15 years from now. So for us to retain that flexibility was really important. We wanted to be able to decide whether, depending on what the rules are, whether we are going to use it for AS or for resource adequacy or for whatever it is. So that was important to us. I think that all that aside, where we could have done a better job, and this is the part that's the most complicated of this, because again, we have a deadline. We have to get these projects online by a certain date, is in our assessment of COD and viability of these projects, both from a construction and a financing standpoint. And so the next time we go through this process, because we're going to probably have to do it again, is we have to be very, very clear that these projects have to come online. And if there's any doubt, and because we'll sign PPAs and then we find out that they're not as viable as we thought, even though they have the full, they've gone through the whole LGI process with ISO, there's still doubts about them. So for us, that's important. And if the development community can't stand behind the projects that they propose, then we're going to have to find another solution, whether it's kind of like a SCAPA or NCPA solution where we build them ourselves, because it's just important for us to have these resources online to meet not just our load and our carbon-free objectives, but our obligation under law.
Yeah, I think that there are more milestones that you could put into the RFP to have more confidence that the project is a little bit further down the line. So they're within that existing structure, probably ways that you can slightly tweak and get a little more confidence.
So where was I on the spectrum, though?
Oh, yeah. So that's direct question. I think I made a fairly positive comment about projects that are, if it's in CAISO and we're splitting it, we have $1 per megawatt hour on the PV, and then a capacity price for the storage, and the full dispatch rights go to the utility, the CCA, for the storage, for a relatively 20 plus, longer term, 20 plus years. That's a pretty solid project. And it takes away a certain amount of the guesswork. We're still going to bid anywhere from 20% storage power to maybe 100%. We're still gonna put out different sizes on storage, unless there's a little more definition of, okay, this is our net load that we're serving. When we see the net load, then and how you expect to value it, we might save ourselves the trouble of the extra bids on the low end and the bids on the high end, and put a little more attention onto something closer to the distribution of what's going to be the most useful product for you. So net load is always a very useful item.
All right. So, sorry to cut you off here, but move on to the next topic.
Okay.
But it's sounding, if I'm gathering a bit of what's going on here, is it sounds like there's kind of a useful middle ground that perhaps could be moved towards, where certain parts of the RFP are pretty fixed in expectation. We need exactly this, we need exactly this. I don't care about your creativity, give me this for a low price. But then perhaps there's also space for defined flexibility. We're looking for these things to be optimized by you, the vendor. So don't play around with this space, maybe do play around with this space. And it seems like perhaps that's the common ground to find the best of both worlds.
If we can take out some of the corner cases and put us in a general zone, it can help a lot.
Exactly. So to focus in on a part of that I think often kicks up a lot of these differences is capacity. So I know for off-takers, generally capacity is, to put it in one way, less of a value source and more of a binary. We need a certain amount of capacity credit or, actual balancing capacity, otherwise everything goes black and people hate us. Whereas to a vendor, perhaps capacity is, do we price it by the market or do we price it by some other criteria? And it's a much more vague attribute of the vendor or of the resource to price. So I'm curious to hear some discussion on how to come closer together on understanding the value of capacity in an RFP.
Are we talking about me?
Anyone? Was that clear enough, first of all?
Is it in the context of resource adequacy?
Resource adequacy, or however it's being counted. So I guess to put some more color into that question, I see many proposals in which capacity is relatively ignored, and many batteries like to go for smaller sizings in order to be able to optimize to dispatching to high price spikes. Whereas a thing that came up often in scoring the proposals was their ability to contribute to capacity, which in CAISO is 4 hours, but it seems like the proposals are saying our value is over here in capacity, and the referees are saying actually the value is over here.
That is a good example of, we really don't know how CCAs, for example, value capacity. How important is it? When we do our models, it's mostly focused on the energy dispatch of the solar and the storage in the CAISO, and the value that it would earn versus the PPA cost.
Yeah.
The RA value, we're not sure how important it is, how much total volume the CCAs need, and where they think the approximate value, where is it clearing in the market to be competitive with taking the place of gas turbines, which are now coming out of mothball status or having their retirement deferred. We don't know where we need to, what is the value of putting in a 4-hour solution so that we can provide something useful there. That is a major guess territory for us.
And is there a preference for that capacity being a standalone battery asset within a specific load pocket, or is it system RA that could be, solar and storage in Nevada, that's wheeled in, but on the CAISO system? So like, is there locational value to that capacity, and sort of how is that distribution of value, is that important or not?
Yeah, I think both are valuable.
Yeah.
So for the RFP that we issued, the intent there was to get renewable resources, not a standalone battery. And so, we didn't see a lot of capacity value in the solar, and the ISO doesn't see much capacity value there either. In fact, they completely gave it a haircut this last go around on the effective load carrying capacity calculations. But we did see a value in the battery, and so and it will meet our resource adequacy. I mean, we're working really hard with the CPUC and the Cal ISO to make sure that there is RA counting for these batteries. With that said, I actually thought that developers did a pretty good job valuing the battery capacity, and it seemed very much in line with what the cost of RA is as well. So from having done the RFO a couple years before and then 2 years later, I definitely saw it trending with the avoided cost of resource adequacy. So, but again, through our RFP, we didn't give it a value attribute associated with RA. We were purely looking at it from an energy standpoint, knowing that it had capacity value that we would certainly get to count as well.
But it wasn't part of the explicit evaluation of the project?
Well, it was, but not in the Ascend model.
Got it.
Because it's a different kind of, it's hard to value the RA capacity market in Ascend's model. But we did it offline. So.
Got it. Thanks.
So, being in LA's balancing authority, we don't deal with RA. And I'm not looking at price signals to determine the value of our capacity. We're transmission constraint, and we're looking to load shift so that we can meet our load and our reliability requirement without having to try to build a transmission line from LA to Palo Verde, since that's not going to happen. So the pricing structure of capacity is not simply the pricing structure of capacity. There's transmission, there's constraints, there's other things that are associated with it that would make me utilize that resource that might not normally be in the money. So while I like the idea of the vendor explaining to me the value of the asset, that's really up to me to determine the value of the asset. You're going to assist me with determining the value based on what you know, and that's pricing signals from CAISO and things like that. But I'm going to have to do my due diligence to figure out, if it costs me an extra $10 for transmission, how does that work? Or if I have to potentially lose some reliability or buy ancillary services to meet that reliability component, those are the things that come into play for me. It's not just simply a pricing mechanism.
So to jump onto that, is this just inherently a subjective process, or is there any way to translate some of those thoughts into the original RFP so the vendors know?
So again, I wouldn't normally do our RFP the way we did our RFP, but since we were taking a whole power plant and not just one unit out, we were taking 6 units or 7 units out and trying to create a new portfolio looking at tomorrow instead of looking at yesterday and then supplement new units on an as-needed basis. We would have had it very specific as to what we needed if we were to just take 1 unit out and put something else in its place. But since that wasn't the case, we were looking for an imaginative, looking forward position instead of trying to keep an old relic and then delicately putting stuff into the new paradigm. So I think it should be specific, but in our case it wasn't, and that's unfortunate. But we had 34 vendors respond, and I thought that was huge, and I was very, very excited about reading them, some of them. A few of them. So that's where I am. So there's a lot of other things that are associated with valuing the capacity. I think that the capacity is unique in LA's situation or in the LA Balancing Authority or outside of the CAISO.
I think that there's something interesting about your paradigm where you're transmission constrained, which is not only unique to Glendale, it's also common up the central coast of California and in various pockets in communities around California and other states also, where you have a utility that traditionally had generators in their territory. It's a relatively smaller territory, and they don't have good locations to put large-scale renewables on their existing grid. This is not unique to just Glendale. It exists all over the place. And for developers like us, we're traditionally looking to put something out on the transmission grid and deliver it to your load pocket. That leads me to wonder, are the utilities who have this existing paradigm where they're expected through policy initiatives to close down existing generators and replace them with renewables or renewables plus storage, are they planning to upgrade their transmission rights or their transmission grid, either new lines or upgrade lines, or are they really going to put a large emphasis on, instead of procuring the large-scale stuff that we're proposing, trying to put more and more emphasis into DER development?
Okay, all right. Well, I think the building of transmission in the LA Basin or in the Southern California Basin is really pie in the sky. I don't think that, let's put it this way, I haven't seen the massive build-out or the potential massive build-out that's needed to go 100% renewable or at least 100% clean in all the years that I've been working in the utility. Yes, they've taken 287 lines and brought them to 500 kV, so they increased the capacity of existing lines, but actually procuring new right-of-ways to create new transmission lines, I'm bearish on that. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. Well, my lifetime's not that long, but I don't think it's going to happen in a relatively short period of time in order for us to get to the 2045 number. That being said, we need to look at our existing transmission, and we need to take renewables from remote resources and firm them up with storage, or to be able to maximize the amount of energy flowing on our existing transmission, and then deal with that inside our city. So if my transmission is limited and I could increase my light load or off-peak energy flowing into my system and charge a battery and then discharge the battery between 16 and 2000, then I could actually theoretically load shift and I can reduce my dependence or my need for new transmission. And that's huge. But there's only so much of it. I would love to have more. And I don't think it's based on price. I think that the people that are transmission deficient will pay whatever it takes to do that. But there is no opportunity right now to increase transmission in my situation into the Southern California Basin.
So I think this topic of transmission and location and these areas that used to have local generation and now can't in the renewable scheme kind of opens up an interesting topic of, if there are many off-takers who can't necessarily assign a price to the locational component, how does that work on the vendor side? What information would you want to see in an RFP regarding transmission, ability to get into an area? Are you site dependent, where we're just going to develop in this area no matter what? Or, oh, they actually have this capacity need locally, let's start looking at knocking down a Walmart and building in the middle of town? What helps you guys on that front?
Maybe for the standalone storage, that knocking down maybe it's not a Walmart, maybe a Kmart, and building in town might work. But for many constrained locations, perhaps renewables plus storage relatively closer to the load would work. it's going to be higher cost though. If you're building within 10 miles of the coast in California, then it's, or within 50 miles of the coast maybe even, it's going to be closer to the load, but it might be 10 or 20% more expensive due to higher land costs and less irradiance. But maybe it solves the problem in the most cost-effective way. But that's another great example of it's hard for us to know as a developer whether or not it's going to make sense to invest in a project now, developing the project, getting the interconnection in the land as those real estate risks. That is exactly where we think that it's maybe within very close proximity to where those generators are going to be retired, but and where is existing transmission constraint, but it's very difficult for us to know what is the value of that location, because it is going to be 20% more expensive instead of being low 20s in dollar per megawatt hour for the solar. It might be 20% more expensive than that. Might actually, that's in many cases probably the most cost-effective solution, but it would be a huge risk for us to develop that project, get it into a state where the utility says, oh, they've got the interconnection phase 1 results, at least they've got the initial permitting of the land, so I feel confident that they're going to deliver this on the timeline I need. But without us having any feedback that that's going to solve their problem, it's a huge, millions of dollars of risk to develop a hundreds of megawatt project with no idea about how that's going to be valued.
I think one thing that we asked for in the RFP that was kind of a go-around on that issue was, for sure you had to propose a price at the P node, so wherever your project's located, all of them being remote to where we are in Silicon Valley. But we also asked you to give us a price at the DLAT and at NP15 to kind of deal with, for us it was more a financial risk than it is a wires risk. And so most of the proposers gave us those options, and it was really interesting to see kind of those spreads as well. Some were really big, which to us indicated that they felt their project was going to be subject to a lot of curtailment and a lot of basis risk, and some were really small, which I guess indicated the opposite, or they just didn't really look at it. But that was, how did you guys feel about?
To us, that is really a reflection not of what we think the actual calculation is, but it's not in our business model to take on that risk. Even if we hire a consultant to run the basis analysis between the two locations and we come up with 1 or 2% curtailment, especially once you add the storage, that's good, but that's not, our project financiers aren't used to taking that kind of risk. They're used to settling at the bus bar, and that is, and so for us, we even inflate the risk because it's not one that is in our normal wheelhouse. And so it adds cost to the overall solution.
Did you have a comment there, Josh?
I was just going to talk about, from like a standalone storage developer, just thinking about in and around LA, for example, vacancy rates are so low. Like if you're close to the load pocket, getting an option on the land for a 100 megawatt project, people don't want to give 3-year options, right? And so the carrying cost to get the option, to file your interconnection, to advance an asset at a place where you've done the transmission, understand you can interconnect, when you don't really have that sense of exactly what the need is. I mean, this is a developer's risk, but there's just, there is serious cost for just putting chips on the table to play there.
So
that's real.
So what kind of information could you get to be reassured that it's worth undertaking that risk?
Understanding sort of locational value and needs and what's coming down the pipe with as much sort of runway as we can, so it's not a scramble last minute is certainly something that's helpful.
So that kind of sounds like you would need information outside of an individual RFP. You
That's
need
right.
general market information that says this is an area that needs localized batteries.
And that can come in IRPs, which are public.
Right,
and
fair
we can
enough.
do that research.
Okay, well, time is almost running out, so I wanted to make sure if anyone had any burning questions in the audience that we still have time for that. Has anyone got a question over here up front? Is there a mic that can go to him?
I can be loud.
I'll go for it.
Yeah. So I didn't hear anything about I guess it's a question from both sides, right? There is a lot of thought around how you manage the risk around degradation of a battery, mostly around larger energy storage. And to a great extent, utilities kind of dump it on, thank you, kind of dump it on the developer side, and they basically ask for a warranty or a guarantee or whatever, right? And then they send it back to utilities and say, here's our guardrail, make sure you don't go out of this. And it's sort of back and forth. From both sides, maybe from utilities, is there any appetite for you to take the risk and not ask for the warranty, ask for a guarantee on performance, so you get the curves, the degradation curves, and you manage it? And from developer side, do you guys have that option or give that option to manage the warranty of the battery to the utilities?
Sure. The key there is if the utility provides a use case, we can get any battery to match that use case. And you can also give flavors of the use case. Like here's one where I intend to use the battery for a bunch of ancillary services. And here's a case where I intend to do a bunch of energy shifting. We can bound that. We can price that with the vendors of the actual batteries, LG Chem, Samsung, Tesla, et cetera, and provide that product back. What you can also do is provide guardrails that say, well, with it, you can use the battery within this use profile or these use profiles. And if you want to go outside of that, we can also price the extent for you to go outside of that. There are things called flexible warranties that you can work with batteries. And that kind of gives us that ability to assume all that technology risk as a developer and offer maybe a tolling agreement that does have a wide use profile for your battery for the
I
utilities.
I wasn't very clear. I was asking for the other way around. Are you prepared for giving that risk to utilities, having them take the risk in offering a much lower price in the storage? Because a lot of that has to do with warranty.
Yep.
When it comes to storage, you can kill it by just cycling through, 100 to 0 in maybe 5,000 or 4,000. And if you manage it properly, you can have hundreds of thousands of cycles. So are you prepared to give that risk to the utilities and lower the price of your storage?
Yeah, my experience is none of the utilities are interested in that.
Right.
So all the ones we've spoken to have said, you manage that risk. Because otherwise it's on their ratepayers.
Right.
So-
And you have to remember, when I start a combined cycle, I know what my minimum generation is and how long it takes to start that combined cycle. I know where it goes, what the heat rate is. I feel comfortable in that realm. When you give me something that I'm not used to, like a battery that's going to cost me an astronomical amount of money with no energy associated with it, I don't feel comfortable taking on that risk for 15 or 20 years.
I mean, in many cases, the developer isn't even taking that risk. They're just passing it all to the system integrator. And it depends on the developer, but we haven't seen utilities have willingness to do that
So
yet.
I guess the big discrepancy with the cost of storage when you look at it is people say, well, it's only $200. No, it's not. It's more like $600. When you add these things to it, it can really balloon out. And the utility can just receive a warranty on performance of the batteries. You just receive the curves. Here's the degradation, and we warranty that, but you take care of it. You don't go outside of those boundaries. Basically, instead of you insuring that risk, you give that to the utility, making sure that they don't exceed those boundaries.
I mean,
It's simple as that.
We have seen cases where a utility will say, look, we want the base case to be 50 cycles equivalent of throughput, and then we give them a variable O&M payment, which is what you referenced, where they could do a cycle a day equivalent, and then they just pay that flexible payment over time. So it is a form, I think, of what you're suggesting.
All right. Well, I think that's about our time. So, we got one more question.
I was just going to jump in to that question. I think it's an interesting one about ways to lower the cost of the utilities and the ratepayers. Ultimately, that's what we're all here trying to manage. Mark Fillinger, Candela Renewables. In a former life, I negotiated the APS contract that you showed the heat map up there a couple times, and that's kind of what APS was looking for in that case. They weren't looking for a fixed full capacity. They actually were interested in the lower cost scenario where they could let that battery degrade over time. The guardrails that were defined in that contract were around a capacity factor. So you had a minimum capacity factor of 70% that you had to meet in those core hours. So, there's a lot of metrics and flexibility that you described in the different forms of PPAs. That's how they addressed that question. It was a lot lower cost solution than the sort of capacity maintenance agreement that a lot of the PPAs are asking for. So I just wanted to share that. And I would, Monica, your RFP was great. The Glendale one was a very challenging one. LADWP was fantastic in being very specific. Originally, I thought APS was a very good one because they were very clear on what they were looking for. But as we all know, when you get into those PPA negotiations, there's a lot of, oh, we didn't really think about that. How do you hand off control? Who is the scheduling coordinator? Is it one party or do you share that role? So there's a lot of things that come up, and I think it's just a function of this is a very early stage of the renewables plus battery. You know, we've got like 120 megawatts on the grid, I think currently, and we've got thousands of megawatts of contracts signed. So we're going to see a huge evolution here like we have seen in the just PV only RFPs. I think in the next 2 years, we'll be looking back at 2019 and saying, boy, that was simple. Now it's a lot more complicated.
Excellent. Well, honestly, I don't think I could have summarized the panel any better. Thank you for that. So let's give a thank you to our wonderful panelists here. Thank you very much.